They're the frights and bumps in the night. They make you sleep with the lights on. They are horror movies. All the blood, guts, and gore and screams that come along with it. But what exactly makes them so scary? Why do we, the viewer, get so scared from men in masks and sharks in the ocean? Basically, what makes horror movies scary? Through my own personal research, I believe to have found that answer to those questions. By looking at the film techniques, the psychological aspect, and the directors behind the horror, I believe that these are the three components that will make horror films scary.
Here's Johnny!
A horror film has a simple objective to its audience: provide a story that allows the audience to believe and scare them. However, it's a lot easier said than done, which is why directors need to come up with creative ways to portray horror on film. In this segment of film techniques, we're going to look at two famous horror movies, 1973's The Exorcist and 1999's The Blair Witch Project. These two films provide creative techniques on how directors can scare you in a horror film. Both these movies use different story techniques, one being a traditional narrative, the other being found footage. However, they both use the same film technique: show, don't tell. This technique is used to provide as much visual evidence the viewer needs to understand something than rather have explained. The beauty of this is how creative directors can be with what they want to say. In The Exorcist, there are two great examples I have. In the very beginning of the film, and the first incident with Regan. In the very beginning, Father Merrin is at an archaeological dig in Iraq. There, he finds an amulet which resembles the statue of Pazuzu, a demon who Merrin defeated years ago. Merrin then realizes the demon has returned to get his revenge. In this scene, we see a clock stop ticking in the man's office once Merrin realizes Pazuzu is back. In this little instance, seeing the mention of the demon's name has the power to stop a clock intrigues us. This would be a visual red herring. Now, the second great example would be when the young child Regan begins being possessed by the demon. One night, Regan's babysitter is found dead outside her building on a huge set of stairs. Her mother rushes up to her room as she bursts in. The next shot shows Regan's window open that overlooks the front of the house. It isn't revealed until later, when Regan is fully possessed by the demon, that her strength is what killed her babysitter. But it's showing us, instead of simply telling us as the viewer, we're able to infer a lot by developing a fear of something we haven't seen yet. The same method is applied in the Blair Witch Project, about three student filmmakers who get lost in the woods searching for the famed Blair Witch. What's great about this film is its handheld style of filmmaking. By having the viewer see only what the actual filmmaker sees makes the scares even better by wondering what's in the next frame. The witch is never seen throughout the film, but all of her actions are clearly noticed. At first, it starts off small rock piles being built around their tent, waking up to their bags being covered in slime, hearing a cackling at night. The film peppers in interviews of people around the Blair Witch area as well. They include stories about encounters with the witch and a famous murderer in the town, including that of a serial killer who would kidnap and kill children. The twist was he would take two of them down at a time in the basement and make one child stand in the corner as he kills the other one. Now, instead of being told his information, we're shown all his information, which we all use to apply towards the ending. The filmmakers search her house believing the witch to be there. As both of them have cameras, we are set up for a tense ending. The first cameraman goes down to the basement and drops the camera. It then cuts to the second cameraman as she is searching for her friend. We follow her downstairs as we see the first cameraman standing in the corner. She then screams and drops the camera. But having been shown all these scary moments earlier in the film, it makes the horror of the ending that much better. These two different films provide the perfect example of great film techniques that make horror movies scary. The underlying theme in horror that keeps scaring people again and again, what is it exactly? There's something about horror that speaks directly and instinctively to the human animal. From years of evolution, humans have ingrained in their brains the basic human fears. Fear the dark, fear the creature chasing you, fear the animals that can kill you in an instant. While man has evolved and become more civilized, the fears have still laid in their brains. The right amygdala associated with fear and learning responds to images of animals rather than people. The fear never goes away, which is why a lot of horror films feature an animal or animal-like creature as the villain, because it is guaranteed to get a response from people. Now what about the villains that are humans? Why do they get a fear response as well? The human villains portrayed in films are so memorable, not only from the acting and believability, but for their animal-like characteristics that turn them into the human monster. The fear of being eaten alive is why cannibalistic traits from Dracula and Hannibal Lecter succeed in creating fear. The fears we have help shape what the filmmakers want to show to frighten the viewer. Our psychological fear is the foundation for the cheesy monster movies of the 1950s to present day with all the countless zombie, vampire, and serial killer films. Two directors who are legendary when it comes to making horror films scary are Wes Craven and Alfred Hitchcock. Craven is credited with making some of the most brutal and terrifying films, such as A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Hills Have Eyes, and Scream, to name a few. While Craven has never planned on being known for horror films, he says it was pure happenstance. What started for him being asked to make a scary movie for a local theater blew up into him being a horror icon. What Craven applied to a lot of his earlier films with image and interesting plot device, for example, consciousness, and then adding scary elements around it. So taking the idea of consciousness and applying scary elements turns into Freddy Krueger entering your dreams and killing you in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Numerous of critics and fans, on the other hand, consider Alfred Hitchcock as the master of suspense. But that doesn't mean his movies aren't scary. Hitchcock films have changed horror films to add the psychological thriller because of the impact they brought. Films like Psycho and Rear Window help provide Hitchcock's classic suspense stories where no one knows where's it going, because that helps the public embrace Hitchcock's version of horror. Instead of tons of blood and terror, his films give you a sense of dread, not knowing who's after whom. In Rear Window, for example, the wheelchair-bound main character would spy on his neighbors in his apartment complex and found out one of his neighbors is a serial killer. The terror comes from knowing there's a killer loose, but the main character can't do anything to protect himself. The tension comes from wondering, is the killer going to find him? Or can he try and stop him when he's in a wheelchair? In Psycho, the main female lead was killed within the first 30 minutes, which was unheard of in 1959. And that meant no character was safe from this killer, leaving the viewer to wonder, who's next? It's from this type of tension Hitchcock provided his type of horror, which could be just as effective to make you squirm. Both films hold little to no blood and relied only on the tension from each scene, making the audience even more wound up with each new frame. What both these directors have shown is that making a horror film scary, it doesn't have to be a cliched option. From having an intriguing concept and adding horror elements around it, to providing the horror from just building up tension, the scares can come from anywhere. Horror films will always try to provide a brand new scare to get people back in theaters each year. But by knowing how these films make a person scared, the viewer can appreciate the movie much more than only seeing it as a cheap scare. Horror films will always be entertaining as they provide the entire human experience from life to death at some point in their stories. These films will always have an impact, whether it's from talented directors, clever film techniques, the psychological themes, or from just a twisted horror that can be imagined on screen. It's what keeps us awake at night, replaying those thoughts in your head, trying to assure yourself it's not real, it's only a movie. There are things that make horror films scary, and they'll always be around.